1,400 horsepower, an engine block derived from a road car, a lifespan measured not in miles, but in minutes. In 1986, a BMW mechanic stares at a dynamometer screen that has stopped displaying numbers because the machine cannot calculate power figures this high. The wastegates are welded shut. The turbochargers are spinning at 180,000 RPM. The driver is sitting on a fuel tank filled with 80% toluene rocket fuel. This is the absolute limit of mechanical violence. But within 3 years, this entire philosophy will be outlawed, destroyed by a political pen stroke. Why does Formula One repeatedly build the ultimate machines, only to execute them? The Turbo Monsters, 1977 to 1988. The first great engine war of the modern age began not with a roar, but with a puff of white smoke. In 1977, Renault debuted the RS01 at Silverstone. It was powered by a V6 single-turbo engine, a radical departure from the atmospheric engines that had dominated the sport for a decade. The experiment was a disaster. The car suffered from severe turbo lag and frequent mechanical failures. It was mocked as the yellow teapot. Yet, 2 years later, a twin-turbo Renault won the French Grand Prix. The writing was on the wall. At high-altitude circuits like Kyalami and Interlagos, where the air was thin, the atmospheric engines gasped for breath, while the turbos simply forced more air into the combustion chamber. By 1983, the turbo revolution was absolute. Brabham BMW and Tolman Hart joined the fray. Nelson Piquet took the world championship in the Brabham BMW BT52, the first title ever won by a turbocharged car. The gloves were off. There were no restrictions on budget, boost levels, or the number of engines a team could burn through in a weekend. The manufacturers began a development war that would push internal combustion to the edge of physics. The peak of this insanity arrived in 1986. The BMW M12/13 inline-4 engine became the defining mechanical predator of the era. In qualifying trim, with the wastegates effectively removed and the turbo boost dialed up to 5.5 bar, this 1.5-liter engine produced an estimated 1,400 horsepower. The exact figure remains unknown because BMW's dyno stopped reading at 1,280 brake horsepower. This power unit, based on a standard BMW M10 engine block from 1961, was a grenade with the pin pulled. It would last for perhaps 4 laps, just enough to secure pole position before disintegrating. The sensory assault was total. These cars were noisy, smelly, and ferocious, trailing smoke from unburned hydrocarbons due to the rich fuel mixtures required to cool the pistons. But this level of performance came with a cost that the governing body, FIA, could no longer ignore. The speeds were escalating beyond the safety limits of the circuits, and the costs were spiraling out of control, threatening to bankrupt the independent teams. The turbo era had to die. The execution was slow and deliberate. In 1987, the FIA introduced a pop-off valve to cap turbo boost pressure at 4 bar during qualifying, while naturally aspirated engines were allowed unlimited fuel. The following year, the noose tightened further. For the 1988 season, the boost limit was slashed to 2.5 bar, and the fuel tank capacity was reduced to 150 liters for turbo cars. This regulatory strangulation created a unique engineering challenge for the final year of the turbo. Honda, the dominant engine supplier, did not simply update their 1987 unit. They built the RA168E, a V6 turbo specifically designed to operate at the lower 2.5 bar limit. This engine powered the McLaren MP4/4. Despite the restrictions, the Honda V6 produced 685 horsepower at 12,300 RPM in qualifying trim. The death of the turbo era was not a fade to black, it was a demonstration of total mastery. The MP4/4, driven by Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost, won 15 of 16 races in 1988. The car's dominance was not just about horsepower, it was about efficiency. The team had to manage extreme fuel conservation to finish race distances on just 150 liters. The drivers were managing boost and fuel consumption lap by lap, corner by corner. But even total domination could not save the technology. The regulations were set. Turbochargers were banned completely for 1989. The era of forced induction, of wastegate chatter and visible flames was over. The sport reset to a 3.5-liter, naturally aspirated formula, forcing every manufacturer to throw away their turbo research and start from scratch. The screaming V12, 1989 to 1995. The death of the turbo birthed the era of the atmosphere. With forced induction illegal, the only way to make power was to increase displacement and rotational speed. This shift initially favored the V12 configuration, which offered perfect primary and secondary balance and immense top-end power. Ferrari, who had raced V6 turbos throughout the 80s, immediately reverted to their heritage. The Tipo 035/5, a 3.5-liter 65-degree V12, debuted in the 1989 Ferrari 640. It produced 660 horsepower at 13,000 RPM. It was unreliable, but it won on its debut. The sound was distinct, a high-pitched, piercing shriek that would become the acoustic signature of the early 90s. Honda, having conquered the turbo regulations, now sought to conquer the atmosphere. In 1991, they introduced the RA121E, a 60-degree V12 engine. It was a masterpiece of heavy engineering, producing up to 780 horsepower at 14,800 RPM. This engine powered the McLaren MP4/6. The peak of the V12 era belongs to Ayrton Senna and the 1991 season. The McLaren MP4/6 was not the most technologically advanced car on the grid. That honor belonged to the Williams FW14, but it had the Honda V12. Senna won the first 4 races of the season, but soon found himself under siege from the Renault-powered Williams. He demanded more power. Honda responded, pushing the V12 to its absolute limit. Senna secured his 3rd world title at Suzuka, making the MP4/6 the only V12-powered car to ever win the championship in this specific regulatory period, and the last car to win a title with a manual gearbox. However, the V12 had a fatal flaw. It was heavy, and it was thirsty. While it could produce immense top-end power, it lacked the drivability and torque out of slow corners compared to the V10 engines being developed by Renault. The V12 required larger fuel tanks, which compromised the chassis design and weight distribution. As the 1990s progressed, the engineering consensus began to shift away from 12 cylinders, yet Ferrari refused to let the configuration die without a fight. In 1994, under the guidance of former Honda engineer Osamu Goto, Ferrari introduced the Tipo 043. This was a 75-degree V12 designed from scratch. By the end of the season, it was producing 850 horsepower at 15,800 RPM. It stands as the most powerful, naturally aspirated V12 engine ever used in Formula One history. The sound of the 043 at full throttle was a physical force, a sonic weapon that defined the visceral appeal of the sport. But performance alone could not save the V12. The FIA, reeling from the tragic events of 1994, mandated a reduction in engine capacity from 3.5 liters to 3.0 liters for the 1995 season. Ferrari adapted, producing the Tipo 044/1, a 3-liter V12 that produced 700 horsepower at 17,000 RPM. It powered the Ferrari 412 T2, a beautiful, competitive car that Gene Alesi drove to victory in Canada. This was the last stand. The 412 T2 remains the last Formula One car powered by a V12 engine. The configuration was simply no longer competitive against the V10. The V12 was powerful, but its thirst for fuel and its physical length were aerodynamic and strategic liabilities. At the end of 1995, even Ferrari, the spiritual home of the 12-cylinder engine, abandoned the layout. They switched to a V10 for 1996, ending a lineage that traced back to the very first Ferrari Formula One cars. The V12 did not die because of a ban. It died because it was obsolete. The V10 Supremacy, 1995 to 2005. The 3-liter formula that killed the V12 ignited the V10 era. This configuration, with 10 cylinders arranged in a V, offered the perfect compromise between the power of a V12 and the efficiency and packaging of a V8. It was lighter than a V12, shorter, and consumed less fuel, allowing for smaller tanks and better aerodynamics. Renault had been the architect of this shift. Their V10 engines powered Williams and Benetton to dominance in the mid-90s. The 1995 Benetton B195 used a Renault RS8, producing 675 horsepower at 15,200 RPM. It was the template for the future. By 2000, the V10 configuration was made mandatory by the FIA to prevent costly experimentation with other layouts. The format was locked, and the manufacturers turned their attention to rotational speed. The battle for RPM became the defining characteristic of the V10 era. In the late 90s, Mercedes, supplying McLaren, used beryllium aluminum alloy pistons to push their engines beyond 17,000 RPM. Ferrari, having abandoned the V12, rapidly closed the gap. By 2002, the BMW P82 engine in the Williams chassis broke the 19,000 RPM barrier in qualifying. 1 year later, the BMW P83 hit 19,200 RPM and cleared 900 brake horsepower. These engines were screaming, high-frequency banshees that vibrated the very air around the circuit. The peak of the V10 era, and perhaps the peak of internal combustion in Formula One, occurred in 2004 and 2005. There were no limits on revs. Manufacturers were using exotic materials and extreme bore-to-stroke ratios to chase 20,000 RPM. In 2005, Honda's RA004E engine reportedly exceeded 965 horsepower. By the end of the 2005 season, the Toyota RVX-05 was producing over 1,000 horsepower in the back of the Jarno Trulli's car. This was the zenith. The cars were producing nearly as much power as the turbo monsters of the 80s, but doing so without forced induction, relying solely on atmospheric pressure and rotational violence. But this arms race was unsustainable. The costs were astronomical, with manufacturers spending hundreds of millions to gain a few hundred RPM. The speeds were becoming dangerous, and the FIA began to intervene. The death process of the V10 was regulatory strangulation designed to save the teams from themselves. First, in 2004, the FIA introduced the single-engine rule. One engine had to last an entire race weekend. This forced engineers to prioritize durability over qualifying grenades. In 2005, the rule was extended to 2 race weekends per engine. Yet, the power figures kept climbing. The engineers were too good. The engines were too fast. The FIA decided that a fundamental change was required to reduce power and cut costs. For the 2006 season, the 3-liter V10 was banned. It was replaced by a 2.4-liter V8 formula. The decision was met with dismay by fans and drivers alike, who mourned the loss of the V10's distinctive howl and its earth-shattering power. The transition was abrupt. The V10s were silenced, replaced by the harsher, lower-powered V8s. A loophole allowed Scuderia Toro Rosso to run a rev-limited Cosworth 510 in 2006 to save costs, a ghost of the previous era competing against the new generation. But the true era of the V10, the era of unlimited development and 19,000 RPM screams, ended at the checkered flag of the 2005 Chinese Grand Prix. The evolution of speed. The death of each engine era in Formula One was never an accident. It was a deliberate, violent correction. The turbo era died because 1,400 horsepower in a chassis weighing 540 kilograms was a recipe for catastrophe. The wastegates were welded shut not just on the cars, but on the sport's sanity. The ban in 1989 forced the engineers to rediscover the atmosphere, leading to the sonic perfection of the V12. The V12 died not by the pen of the regulator, but by the cold logic of competition. It was romantic, loud, and powerful, but it was inefficient. The physics of the V10, lighter, shorter, less thirsty, simply strangled the V12 out of existence. It was a Darwinian extinction. The Ferrari 412 T2 was the last dinosaur, roaring in defiance before the asteroid of the Renault V10 hit. The V10 era died because it became too successful. The manufacturers mastered the format so completely that they broke the financial and safety structures of the sport. When BMW and Honda are pushing 20,000 RPM and touching 1,000 horsepower without a turbocharger, the only way to slow them down is to outlaw the very architecture of the engine. Every death was a birth. The end of the turbo brought us the V12. The failure of the V12 gave us the V10. The legislative execution of the V10 gave us the V8, and eventually the hybrid power units of today. Formula One engines do not evolve gradually. They are built to the limit, destroyed by the rulebook, and then rebuilt from the ashes, faster and more efficient than before. Technical legacy. We must look at the specific mechanisms of these deaths to understand the engineering reality. In the turbo era, fuel chemistry became a weapon. By 1985, teams were running fuels composed of 80% toluene to prevent detonation at extreme boost pressures. This rocket fuel allowed them to run compression ratios that would shatter a normal engine. When the FIA restricted fuel tanks to 150 liters in 1988, they didn't just limit range. They forced Honda to redesign the entire combustion cycle of the RA168E to extract more energy from every drop. This efficiency work laid the foundation for the atmospheric engines that followed. The V12 era was defined by the struggle against friction and inertia. To make a large 12-cylinder engine rev to 15,000 RPM requires metallurgical sorcery. The pistons and connecting rods experience accelerations of nearly 10,000 Gs at top dead center. Ferrari's Tipo 043 used a wider 75-degree bank angle to shorten the stroke and lower the center of gravity, allowing it to rev higher and produce that record-breaking 850 horsepower. But all that moving metal created parasitic losses that the lighter V10S did not suffer. The V10 era brought the pneumatic valve spring to total dominance. Metal springs could not close the valves fast enough at 18,000 RPM. They would float and destroy the engine. Compressed air systems, introduced by Renault and perfected by everyone else, allowed the valves to track the cam profile perfectly at speeds that turned metal into liquid. The BMW P83, weighing less than 91 kilograms, was a testament to this optimization. It was an engine that did not just produce power, it vibrated with a frequency that shattered the reliability of gearboxes and chassis components alike. The human element. Behind the metallurgy and the regulations were the drivers who had to tame these transitions. Alain Prost spanned the turbo and V10 eras, winning championships in both. He adapted his smooth, conservationist style to the brutal power delivery of the Porsche TAG Turbo, managing his fuel and tires while others blew up. When the V10 era arrived, he was there to pilot the Renault-powered Williams to his fourth title, proving that the driver's adaptability is the ultimate variable. Ayrton Senna defined the transition from turbo to V12. His mastery of the Honda Turbo in the MP4/4 is legendary. But his struggle with the V12 in the MP4/6 showed the reality of the engineering shift. He spent the early part of 1991 demanding more power from Honda, fighting against the torque-rich Renault 510s. His victory was a triumph of will over physics. Michael Schumacher's career bridges the death of the V12 and the rise of the V10. He tested the Ferrari 412 T2, declaring it good enough to win a championship, but he won his first title with a Ford V8, and his dynasty with the Ferrari V10. He rode the wave of the V10's development from 715 horsepower in 1996 to around 920 horsepower in 2004. The history of Formula One engines is a history of extinction. We look back at the BMW M12/13, the Ferrari Tipo 043, and the BMW P83 not just as engines, but as artifacts of a time when the limits were different. They died because they were too dangerous, too expensive, or simply too inefficient. But in their death, they proved what is possible when brilliant minds are given a set of rules and told to break them. The explosive truth is that Formula One engines don't die of old age. They are murdered at their peak, and that is why we remember them.